The bustling newsroom of the Morning Herald was a symphony of ringing phones, clacking keyboards, and shouted deadlines. Into this lively chaos stepped Sebastian, the newly hired mail clerk. His arrival had been so quiet that some staff hadn't even realized he was there until their mail started arriving faster and more organized than ever before. The mailroom itself was tucked into a quiet corner of the building, a cozy, slightly cluttered space that seemed to hum with its own rhythm. Rows of wooden mail slots lined the walls, each labeled meticulously with the names of reporters, editors, and staff. A sturdy, well-worn desk sat at the center of the room, its surface scattered with envelopes, packages, and a small stack of Sebastian's personal tools. A letter opener, a bottle of ink, and an antique-looking pen that gleamed faintly under the warm light of a vintage desk lamp. The air carried the faint scent of paper and ink, mixed with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting in from the nearby break room. Sebastian moved through this space with a natural ease, as though the room itself responded to his presence. His young face, with its soft features and quiet intensity, seemed to take in every detail, and his hands worked with a precise efficiency that transformed the chaotic piles of mail into neatly organized deliveries. Despite the fast pace of his work, there was a quiet grace in everything he did, from the way he gently handled a fragile package to the soft click of the mailroom door closing behind him. Sebastian had a peculiar charm. His youthful appearance, with its gentle expression and subtle focus, seemed to hold the weight of countless untold stories, and his ever-so-slight smile could ease even the most frayed nerves. He was known for his punctuality, delivering mail with a nod and a soft-spoken, "Good morning." While many considered him kind and thoughtful, he remained an enigma, never sharing much about himself. The newsroom staff ranged from boisterous reporters to meticulous editors. Sebastian's role as the mail clerk placed him in every corner of the office. He moved seamlessly in and out of people's lives, always present but never lingering, like a gentle breeze. It suited him well. He preferred to observe the world rather than be the center of it. But if you looked closely, there was something extraordinary about him, though no one had yet realized it. Mrs. Klein, the finance manager, was a no-nonsense woman who walked with a noticeable limp. Her sharp features were framed by silver-streaked hair, always pinned back in an elegant bun, and her tailored suits gave her an air of professionalism that commanded respect. Her glasses, perched on the edge of her nose, would often slide down as she focused intently on her ledgers. Occasionally, she would reach up to push them back, her fingers moving with precise, deliberate movements, like everything she did. She had once mentioned in passing to Sebastian that arthritis had been her lifelong torment, though her determined gait, despite the limp, spoke of a woman who refused to let it define her. Her lips often pressed into a thin line as she worked, a reflection of the weight of responsibility she bore in silence. One afternoon, as Sebastian handed her a stack of invoices, her hand accidentally brushed his. She felt an odd warmth that radiated from him, like sunlight breaking through clouds on a chilly day, soothing and inexplicably comforting. She froze for a brief moment, her hand lingering in the air as if caught in an invisible web. She glanced at Sebastian, but he simply smiled, as if nothing had happened. She thought nothing of it until the next morning, when she awoke to find her legs moving freely, unencumbered by the stiffness and pain that had shadowed her for years. As she walked to work, her usual careful pace was replaced with a fluidity that felt foreign yet exhilarating. She marveled at the newfound ease in her stride, her heart swelling with a mix of disbelief and joy. Mrs. Klein's limp was gone. She moved through the office with a newfound grace, her colleagues stopping mid-sentence to take in the transformation. Even the faint clack of her heels on the tile floor seemed lighter, almost musical, as though echoing her lifted spirit. She caught Turner's eye as she passed his desk, and for a moment she saw the surprise flicker in his gaze before he quickly looked back down at his typewriter. At first, she thought it was a fluke, or perhaps her medication finally working, but as the hours passed, she realized the pain that had defined her life was simply gone. "Sebastian, thank you for the mail," she said the next time she saw him, her voice softer than usual, her eyes searching his face for answers she couldn't articulate. Her fingers twitched at the edge of her desk as if to grasp something, but she let them fall back to her side, unsure of what to do with the sudden wave of emotions. Sebastian's smile was gentle but unreadable. He nodded slightly, his eyes softening for just a moment, though the rest of his expression remained as composed as ever. "I'm glad you're feeling better, Mrs. Klein," he said softly, his voice a quiet reassurance, before moving on to his next delivery, his steps light as ever. Mr. Turner, one of the senior reporters, had been struggling with chronic migraines for years. His gruff demeanor and perpetually furrowed brow made him unapproachable to most. His desk, tucked into a corner of the newsroom, was a testament to his relentless work ethic. Stacks of papers and notebooks teetered precariously beside a typewriter that looked as weathered as he did. A half-empty coffee mug, always cold, sat amidst scattered pens and a worn leather notebook filled with half-scribbled ideas. Turner's dedication was unmatched, often spending long hours chasing leads or typing furiously to meet deadlines, but his migraines had become a constant shadow, dulling his usual fire. Yet, even his intimidating presence didn't seem to faze Sebastian. During one particularly hectic day, as the noise of the newsroom swelled around him, Sebastian noticed Mr. Turner rubbing his temples with the heel of his hand, his usual scowl deepening as his brow furrowed tighter in discomfort. His fingers briefly twitched toward his typewriter, only to falter, as if the pain made even typing feel like a monumental task. Without a word, Sebastian quietly placed a cold bottle of water on the edge of Turner's desk, along with the usual stack of mail. He didn't wait for acknowledgement, but the soft click of the water bottle against the paper was enough to break through the haze of Turner's frustration. "Thanks, kid," Mr. Turner grunted, his voice rough, as though the migraine itself was tangled in every syllable. That night, Mr. Turner slept soundly for the first time in years. When he awoke the next morning, the usual pressure behind his eyes was gone. His mind felt clear, his thoughts unburdened. He stretched, taking in a long, steady breath, and realized with amazement that the migraine had vanished. The relief was so profound that for the first time in years, he found himself smiling, an expression so rare that when his colleagues caught sight of it, they jokingly suggested they should take a photo to commemorate the moment. "You're looking good today, Mr. Turner," Sebastian commented the next morning, with a casual but underlying note of sincerity. Mr. Turner looked up, eyes slightly wide, as if the smile still felt foreign. His hand paused over the coffee mug, which was finally warm for once, and he gave a small nod. "I don't know what you did, but thanks, Sebastian," Mr. Turner replied, with a hint of gratitude breaking through the usual gruff exterior. Sebastian simply nodded, his eyes carrying a gentle, unspoken understanding, as though this small change in Turner's day was just another quiet miracle in his world. Sarah, the intern, was a bright spark in the office, but had been sidelined by a debilitating case of eczema. Her hands were raw and cracked, making even simple tasks excruciating. Despite this, she maintained a cheerful demeanor, her optimism like a light in the often stressful newsroom. She had a habit of twirling her pen absent-mindedly when deep in thought, her fingers wrapped in protective bandages that she tried to hide from view. Occasionally, she would pause mid-twirl, her fingers tightening around the pen as she glanced down at her hands, but she would quickly shake off the moment and return to her work with a forced smile. When in conversation, she often tucked a strand of her blonde hair behind her ear, a nervous habit that betrayed her discomfort, especially when she was unsure of her own appearance. One day, Sebastian noticed her struggling to carry a stack of files. His sharp gaze caught the brief wince of pain that flashed across her face as she tried to balance the load. Without hesitation, he stepped in to help, his hand briefly brushing hers as he took the files. She looked up, startled by the warmth of his touch, and offered a quick, grateful smile. "Thanks," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper, a little embarrassed by her own vulnerability. By the next morning, Sarah's skin was flawless. The transformation was so dramatic that she spent an hour staring at her hands in disbelief, tracing her fingers over smooth, unblemished skin that felt like it belonged to someone else. She could hardly believe it. Her hands, once red and cracked, were now soft and healthy. A newfound energy coursed through her. She couldn't stop smiling as she walked into the office, her pace quicker, lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. She greeted everyone with a renewed confidence, her usual cheerful tone now accompanied by an almost giddy energy. Her laughter, once hesitant, rang out freely across the office, carrying a note of freedom and joy. When she finally spotted Sebastian in the mailroom, her gratitude spilled over. Her eyes shone with unshed tears, and for a moment, she was speechless. "I don't know how, but thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her hand trembling slightly as she reached to place it on the counter beside him. Sebastian smiled softly, his expression calm and knowing. He met her gaze, his own eyes filled with quiet reassurance. "You're welcome, Sarah. Take care of yourself." He said the words gently, offering not just a simple thanks, but a shared sense of empathy. One morning, the staff noticed Sebastian wasn't making his usual rounds. The hum of the newsroom felt off, as if the very air had changed. By lunchtime, whispers filled the office. By the next day, panic had set in. "Where's Sebastian?" Mrs. Klein asked, her voice tense with concern as she glanced around the office, her sharp eyes scanning the empty mailroom. "He didn't say anything about leaving," Sarah added, worry etched on her face, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve as she tried to make sense of his sudden absence. The entire office gathered in the mailroom, the space that had once been filled with the quiet shuffle of papers now silent and heavy with uncertainty. His desk was bare, save for a handwritten note, carefully placed in the center. Sarah was the first to reach for it, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the paper. She read aloud, her voice breaking the stillness. "Dear all, it has been my greatest joy to know you and share in your lives, however quietly. I have moved on, not out of sadness, but with hope and purpose. There are others who need the same kindness I have been able to share here, and it is my calling to help them. Please know that each of you has made my days brighter and filled my heart with gratitude. Carry that light forward, and remember that the smallest kindnesses can make the biggest difference. Yours truly, Sebastian." The room was silent for a moment as the words settled in. There were no tears, no outbursts of anger, just a deep, profound sense of understanding. The office workers stood frozen, taking in the unexpected farewell. Mrs. Klein, who rarely showed emotion, cleared her throat as she seemed to wrestle with her feelings. "He was more than just a mail clerk," she said softly, almost as though speaking to herself. The words hung in the air like a delicate truth, one that each person could feel but not quite explain. The others nodded, the reality of his absence already transforming into something else. They didn't know where Sebastian had gone, but they felt no sorrow, only a gentle sense of wonder. It was as though he had left behind a piece of himself in each of their hearts, a quiet reminder to carry kindness wherever they went. Mrs. Klein, with her newfound grace, often paused at her desk, contemplating the quiet gestures of compassion that had once seemed so insignificant. She found herself offering more patience to her colleagues, her sharp edges mellowed by the light Sebastian had left behind. One morning, as she passed Turner's desk, she noticed his usual frown and instead of walking by, stopped and offered a quiet compliment. The modest gesture caught him off guard, but his face relaxed in response, a glimmer of the man who had been slowly emerging after the constant weight of his migraines had lifted. For the first time, Mrs. Klein understood that it wasn't just the big moments that mattered. It was the small things that carried the most weight. Turner, now less tethered to his gruff exterior, began embracing significant acts of improvement. One afternoon, when Sarah was struggling with a heavy load of files, Turner, who had always kept to himself, noticed. His hands paused mid-typewriter, his usual snarl replaced with a thoughtful look. Without a word, he offered to help, his hardened demeanor giving way to an unexpected kindness. Sarah, surprised, gave him a grateful nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her day feel lighter. Sarah, too, had changed. Her laughter rang out more freely, and the way she carried herself was different, as though she now understood the value of her own resilience. One morning, she noticed a colleague, Maria, who had been working late the previous night, her eyes red from exhaustion. Without thinking, Sarah made a cup of coffee and placed it on Maria's desk with a simple note. Take a break. You've earned it. The kindness was returned later that day when Maria offered to help Sarah with an overwhelming task, recognizing the way Sebastian's lesson had quietly passed from one person to another. The atmosphere in the office was evolving. Each person, in their own way, was carrying forward Sebastian's legacy. In small gestures and quiet moments, they shared kindness where before there had only been haste. They had learned, through the gentleness of Sebastian's presence, that every small act made a difference, not just for those around them, but for themselves as well. The newsroom hummed along with its usual rhythm, but there was an underlying shift. Sebastian's memory lived on in every kind word, every thoughtful action, and every moment when someone paused to consider the smallest of kindnesses. Mrs. Klein no longer rushed through her days with rigid efficiency, but took a moment to appreciate the people around her. Turner, who had once been a man of few words, now shared his wisdom more freely. Sarah had become a beacon of optimism, her laughter a reminder of the power of resilience and a quiet heart. Sebastian had left the office, but he had not left them. His lessons had taken root in ways no one could have predicted, and though his physical presence was gone, the warmth of his touch remained. They carried his light forward, in the smallest of acts and the quietest of moments, knowing that the difference they made didn't have to be grand to be meaningful. And so Sebastian's journey continued, not in his absence, but in the legacy he left behind. His impact remained in the hearts of those who had been touched by his kindness, a soft reminder that sometimes the quietest people leave the loudest echoes.